Callum liked to think of himself as a man who appreciated the simple things in life. The kind of person who could spend hours watching the sunlight filter through the trees, or find more satisfaction in a perfectly brewed cup of coffee than in anything the modern world had to offer. His cabin sat on the edge of the forest, a retreat where time seemed to slow enough for him to breathe. Tonight, however, the forest was far from peaceful. The sky above was alive with strange rippling lights. Not quite an aurora, not quite a storm, but something in between. Callum leaned against the porch railing, mug in hand, squinting at the bizarre display. The lights twisted and shimmered, painting the treetops in shades of violet and gold. Well, he muttered to himself, either the northern lights took a wrong turn, or I've had too much coffee. A sudden crashing sound from the underbrush interrupted his musings. Callum set his mug down and grabbed a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness as he made his way down the steps. The noise grew louder, more frantic, and then silence. He stopped, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Hello," he called, his voice steady but cautious. "Anyone out there?" A faint groan answered him, followed by the rustling of leaves. Callum crept forward, sweeping the beam of the flashlight across the forest floor until it landed on a figure sprawled beneath a tree. His first thought was that it was a person, perhaps a woman, but as he moved closer, the details didn't quite add up. Her skin shimmered faintly, like moonlight on water, and her hair, a cascade of light blue strands, seemed to glow in the dark. Most striking of all were her eyes, half open and locked on him. They weren't human eyes. They were galaxies, swirling with stars and nebulae, infinite and unfathomable. Callum froze, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. "Okay," he whispered, "this is either the weirdest wildlife encounter of my life, or I've stumbled into a sci-fi movie." The woman, or whatever she was, tried to sit up but collapsed with a pained cry. Callum hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Hey, take it easy," he said, crouching beside her. "You're hurt." Her gaze met his, and she muttered something in a language that sounded like music played backward. Callum didn't understand a word, but the tone of her voice was pleading. He glanced at her injuries, deep gashes along her arm and side, leaking a light blue fluid that shimmered like mercury. "Right?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. "No idea what you're saying, but you need help." Carefully, he slipped an arm under her shoulders, wincing as she let out a soft whimper. She was surprisingly light, almost weightless despite her height. Callum carried her back to the cabin, his mind buzzing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And, perhaps most importantly, what had hurt her? Inside the cabin, warmth surrounded them, a sharp contrast to the alien strangeness of the woman. He laid her gently on the couch and grabbed his first aid kit, though he doubted bandages and antiseptic would be of much use. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the odd texture of her skin, smooth and cool, like polished stone, yet pliable. The light blue fluid from her wounds didn't clot like blood. Instead, it seemed to crystallize, forming delicate glass-like scabs. "This is officially above my pay grade," he muttered, tying off a makeshift bandage. "Not that I'm getting paid for any of this." The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, then at the bandages, and spoke again in her musical language. Callum held up his hands. "Sorry, no idea what you're saying, but you're welcome, I guess." She frowned as if trying to puzzle out his words, then, to his surprise, mimicked his tone. "You're welcome." Callum blinked. "Well, that's new." "Okay," he said, pointing to himself. "I'm Callum." Her lips moved silently for a moment, and then she repeated, "Callum." "Yeah, close enough," he said with a slight smile. He pointed to her. "And you are?" She hesitated, then placed a hand on her chest. "Rhea." Callum repeated the name. "Nice to meet you, I think." Rhea's lips curved into a faint smile, but it quickly vanished as her gaze darted toward the window. She tensed, her body rigid with fear. Callum followed her line of sight, but saw nothing unusual, just the dark forest and the strange lights still flickering in the sky. "Hey," he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here. No one's getting in without me knowing." Rhea didn't seem entirely convinced, but she relaxed slightly, her breathing slowing. Callum leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "All right, Callum, you've officially lost it. Alien woman on your couch, weird lights in the sky. Tomorrow, you're calling the authorities to let them deal with this." But even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't. Something about Rhea, her vulnerability, her otherworldly presence, made it impossible for him to just walk away. And then there was the nagging question. If she was running from something, what would happen if it found her? Sighing, Callum glanced at her. She had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her expression troubled. "Great," he muttered, turning off the light and settling into his chair. He couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life had just been irrevocably upended. Somewhere deep in the forest, a faint mechanical hum echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. Morning came reluctantly, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of trees surrounding Callum's cabin. The strange lights in the sky had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Callum awoke to the sound of soft, melodic humming. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but then he remembered Rhea. He sat up in his chair, his back protesting after a night of less-than-ideal sleep. Rhea was sitting up on the couch, her light blue skin catching the morning light. She was examining one of the makeshift bandages he had tied around her arm, her expression a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Good morning," Callum said cautiously, his voice cutting through the quiet. Rhea looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Callum," she said, her voice still tentative but clearer than the night before. "That's me," Callum replied, running a hand through his hair. "How are you feeling?" Rhea tilted her head, clearly not understanding the question. Callum gestured to her arm and sighed, mimicking a pained expression. Understanding dawned in her starry eyes. She nodded and then pointed to him. "Better? Well, I'm glad I could help," Callum said, feeling a flicker of pride. "Though I'm not exactly a doctor." Rhea's gaze shifted toward the window, her expression darkening. She spoke in her musical language again, her tone tinged with worry. "Still spooked, huh?" Callum said, following her gaze, though he saw nothing unusual. "Can't blame you. Last night was something." He stood and stretched. "All right, let's get some food in you. Do you eat?" "You eat, right?" Rhea gave him a puzzled look, and Callum sighed. "Right? Of course you don't understand." He walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge, pulling out a loaf of bread and some eggs. "Let's keep it simple, eggs and toast. If you don't like it, we'll figure something else out." As he cooked, Rhea watched him with wide-eyed fascination. Chapter 2: A Visitor in the Shadows. The smell of eggs and toast filled the cabin, the comforting scent contrasting sharply with the strange turn of events that had unfolded in the past 12 hours. Callum flipped the eggs with practiced ease, trying to keep his thoughts from spiraling out of control. Rhea sat at the small wooden table, still watching him intently with those star-filled eyes, her light blue skin catching the light in an ethereal glow. She hadn't said much since the night before, only mimicking his words here and there, but her gaze was unwavering, always seeking to understand. "All right," Callum said, plating the eggs and toast with a flourish. "I hope you're not picky. If you are, I'll start working on my culinary skills next." Rhea tilted her head again, as though considering the food, then glanced up at Callum, a soft hum escaping her lips. It wasn't quite a question, more of an expression of curiosity. "Eggs," Callum clarified, placing the plate in front of her. "Eat." Rhea looked at the plate with a slight frown, as if she had never seen food quite like this before. She reached out hesitantly, touching the toast with a finger, then sniffing it. After a moment, she took a cautious bite. Her eyes widened, and she chewed slowly, as though trying to determine if this was something safe to consume. Callum couldn't help but smile at the strange, endearing sight. "Good." Rhea nodded slowly, then spoke a few words in her melodic language. Callum didn't understand, but her tone seemed appreciative. "Glad you like it," he said, though he wasn't sure she even got the joke. As Rhea continued to eat, Callum leaned against the kitchen counter, observing her closely. His thoughts drifted back to last night, the bizarre encounter in the forest, the otherworldly glow of her eyes, the strange shimmering fluid that had leaked from her wounds. None of it made sense, but one thing was for sure. Rhea was not from around here. The thought made him uneasy. He had already put so much of his quiet life on hold to help her, but as much as he wanted to turn his back and pretend it was all a strange dream, he couldn't. Not when she looked at him with such trust in those otherworldly eyes. As Rhea finished her meal, Callum moved to clean up the dishes. His eyes kept flickering to the window, where the sky was now a pale blue, the strange lights having completely vanished, leaving only the quiet sounds of the forest behind. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. He set the dishes down, walking back to where Rhea sat. Her gaze was once again fixed on the window, her brow furrowed in concentration, as though she could sense something he couldn't. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong?" She turned to him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. She gave him a small, apologetic smile, then pointed to the window. Her eyes widened, full of silent warning. Callum followed her gaze, but saw nothing, just the swaying trees and the quiet forest beyond. "Something out there?" he asked. Rhea didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up, her movements graceful and fluid. She crossed to the window and peered outside again, her eyes scanning the horizon with sharp intensity. Then, in the distance, Callum thought he saw a glimmer, something metallic, catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost too deliberate. "What is that?" he asked, voice tight with concern. Rhea's body tensed at his side, and she spoke in her musical tongue again, the words fast and urgent. Callum couldn't understand any of it, but the tone was unmistakable fear. Panic even. "Rhea," he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What is it? What do you know?" Her eyes met his, dark and wide with anxiety. She took a step away from the window, trembling slightly. Callum's chest tightened. "You're running from something, aren't you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. It was the only explanation that made sense. Rhea didn't respond directly, but her eyes flickered back toward the window. Callum followed her gaze again, and this time he saw it more clearly, a shape moving just beyond the edge of the trees. It wasn't human, not by any stretch. The silhouette was too angular, too unnatural. He grabbed the flashlight again, more urgently this time. "We need to go. Now." Rhea looked up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Callum moved quickly, throwing on his jacket. He knew he couldn't let her stay here any longer, not with whatever that was lurking in the forest. "Listen to me," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, all right? You need to trust me." Rhea hesitated but nodded, her eyes still wide with unease. She glanced toward the door, then back at him, and in a quiet voice that sounded almost foreign, she asked, "Hide?" Callum nodded. "Yes, we'll hide. Stay close, all right?" Together, they moved swiftly, Callum making sure to lock the door behind them. Rhea followed him closely, her steps light, almost too quiet as they moved through the cabin. The light from the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Just as they reached the back door, Callum heard the unmistakable sound of someone, moving through the trees. The rustling was soft, but it was getting closer. Callum's heart raced. "They're coming," he whispered, though he didn't know how many there were or what they wanted. All he knew was that Rhea was in danger, and he had to protect her. They moved toward the small cellar hidden beneath the floorboards. Callum opened the trapdoor and glanced at Rhea. "In here," he said, his voice steady but low. "Quick." Rhea didn't hesitate. She climbed into the small space, her eyes once again scanning the surroundings as she crouched down beside him. Callum quickly followed, pulling the trapdoor closed behind them. In the suffocating silence of the cellar, Callum could hear his heart thudding in his chest. Every creak of the floor above, every faint whisper of movement outside, sent a shiver of unease down his spine. Rhea's hand brushed against his, and for a moment, their eyes met in the dark. There was a strange sense of connection between them, as though their fates had already been intertwined long before he found her in the woods. And then, through the thick, damp air of the cellar, a sound emerged, one Callum would never forget. It was a hum, mechanical and rhythmic, vibrating through the walls, growing louder and closer. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they weren't leaving anytime soon. And Callum knew, deep in his bones, that his life was about to change forever. Chapter 3. The Shadows Close In. The hum was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the cabin, down into the cellar. Callum held his breath, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, mechanical, steady, and undeniably close. Rhea's fingers tightened around his, her body stiff with fear. Callum could feel the tension in her, the weight of something she wasn't telling him, and it gnawed at him. Whatever she was running from, it was here, and it wasn't just some random threat. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. He crouched down lower into the shadows, keeping as still as possible. His hand slowly moved to the flashlight on the floor next to him, but he didn't turn it on. Any light would give them away. Rhea nodded, her light blue skin almost glowing in the dimness, though her expression was unreadable. She had been oddly silent since they'd hidden in the cellar, but now there was something almost resigned in her gaze. Callum's chest tightened, his mind racing. What did she know that he didn't? The hum grew louder still, vibrating through the floorboards above them. It wasn't just a sound. It was an energy, palpable and unsettling. Callum could feel it in his bones, as though the world itself was being slowly pulled apart. "I know you're in there," a voice suddenly called out from above, smooth and authoritative, with a tone that sent a chill down Callum's spine. "You cannot hide forever, Rhea." Callum's breath hitched. Rhea. The way the voice spoke her name, it was familiar, almost intimate. Rhea's grip on his hand tightened, her knuckles going white. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as though steeling herself against whatever came next. Callum's heart pounded in his chest, and he leaned closer to her. "They know your name," he whispered. "Who are they? What do they want?" Rhea hesitated, then opened her eyes. The starlight in her gaze seemed to shimmer with unshed tears, but she didn't speak. Instead, she placed a hand over her chest, as though drawing some invisible strength from within. The voice above them spoke again, cutting through the heavy silence. "It is futile to resist. You belong with us, Rhea. Come now, and we can end this foolishness." Callum's eyes darted toward the trapdoor above, trying to make sense of the voice, the certainty it held. He didn't know who they were, but they clearly knew far more about Rhea than he did, and that wasn't sitting well with him. "I can't go back," Rhea murmured, her voice almost a breath. "I can't let them find me." "Who are they?" Callum asked again, his voice firm but quiet. He needed answers. This wasn't just about some random group searching for a missing person. There was something far bigger at play. Rhea closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging, as though the weight of what was happening was too much to bear. She started, but the words didn't come. She shook her head, trying to push past the fear, to gather herself. "I'm not who you think I am." Callum leaned closer, his breath catching. "What does that mean?" Before Rhea could respond, there was a soft thud from above, the sound of something, or someone, landing lightly on the floor of the cabin. Then came another voice, lower and more guttural, yet equally commanding. "Do you honestly think you can escape the will of the Erethians? You are ours, Rhea. We will bring you home." Callum's mind was spinning. Erethians. The name sounded otherworldly, and it made his skin crawl. Whoever these people were, they weren't human. "Rhea, what are they talking about?" Callum's voice was urgent, but his tone softened when he saw the panic building in her eyes. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not from Earth," she said, her words breaking like glass. "I'm not just some person. I'm—" She hesitated again, fear and sadness swirling in her eyes. "I'm their queen." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Callum blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what she'd just said. Queen. Her queen. He could barely keep up with the implications of what she was telling him. "You're a queen?" he echoed, his voice cracking slightly. Rhea nodded, her hands trembling. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to be their ruler, but I was born into it. I've been running from them for so long. I thought I could escape, but they always find me. The hum above them grew louder again, reverberating through the walls of the cabin. The metallic sound was accompanied by a low, almost mechanical whirring, like the sound of gears turning. Callum's heart raced. He had no idea how to process what Rhea had just confessed, but one thing was clear. Whoever was out there, they weren't here to negotiate. I can't let them take me back, Rhea whispered urgently, her eyes pleading. If they do, they'll use me. They'll make me their puppet again. Callum's chest tightened. He had no idea what it meant to be a queen of another world, but one thing he understood was fear. And the fear in her eyes was real. We can't let them take you, he said, voice firm. We'll fight. We'll hide. Whatever it takes. Rhea looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Her lips trembled, as though she couldn't quite believe he was offering to help. You don't understand. They're not just people. They're powerful, Callum. They'll stop at nothing to get me back. They can do things you can't imagine. Callum didn't have time to process the weight of her words. The noise outside was intensifying, now a rhythmic thrum, like the sound of engines powering up. Whatever had been searching for her was getting closer, and it was clear that Rhea was right. They weren't just looking for her. They were hunting her. We can't hide forever, Callum said, his mind spinning as he tried to figure out their next move. We need a plan. Rhea closed her eyes, taking in a slow breath. I have an idea, she murmured. But it's risky, and it might not work. Anything is better than sitting here and waiting, Callum replied. Rhea's eyes locked onto his. I'll need your help. I can't do this alone. Callum hesitated, then nodded. Tell me what to do. The hum from outside was nearly deafening now, as if whatever was coming had reached the clearing near the cabin. It was only a matter of time before they found the trapdoor, before they found them hiding beneath the earth. And Callum knew that once they did, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 4. The Price of Escape. The pounding of his heart drowned out the rising hum of whatever had come for Rhea. Callum's mind raced as he knelt beside her in the dim cellar, the air thick with tension. The sound of something shifting above them, the low creak of the floorboards, the distant scrape of metal against wood, made his skin crawl. Time was running out. Rhea's gaze was focused, her eyes shimmering with an unnatural light as she sat back against the cold stone walls of the cellar, her breathing shallow. She looked fragile in that moment, vulnerable in a way that made Callum want to protect her with every fiber of his being. But he knew, deep down, that he wasn't the one who would save her. Not in the way she needed. I need to access the energy inside me, Rhea said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze flickered to the door as though she could hear what was coming too. But it's risky. It could draw them straight to us. It might even hurt me. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it together, Callum said firmly, though his mind was a storm of doubts. I'm with you. What do I need to do? Rhea swallowed hard. I need you to trust me. If I can channel enough energy, I can create a shield, a barrier around this place. It might keep them out, but it won't last long. And it might hurt me in the process. Callum could see the hesitation in her eyes. He could see the fear, too. But there was something else there, something that urged him to act. Rhea, you've already been through so much, Callum said gently, kneeling beside her. You don't have to do this alone. Her light blue fingers trembled as she placed them against her chest, right over her heart. I have to do this. If I don't, they'll get me. And if they do, they'll use me. I'll never be free again. Callum knew she was right. The way the voices from above had spoken to her, their tone, so familiar, so commanding, it was clear that whatever they were, they had control over her, had had it for a long time. But if what she was saying was true, if she was really their queen, then that power could turn against them. It had to. Do what you need to do, he said. I'll be right here. You're not alone. Rhea nodded, her expression softening with gratitude, though the tension never left her eyes. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something immense. Slowly, she raised her arms, palms up, and began to hum softly under her breath. A quiet, lilting melody that sounded like it was woven from the very fabric of the stars themselves. Callum watched, his chest tight, as the air in the cellar began to feel heavier, charged. The light in the room seemed to dim, and the very ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. Rhea's energy was rising. He could feel it like a pulse beneath his skin. The temperature dropped, and the hum grew louder, sharper. Her voice began to grow more intense as she chanted in her alien tongue, her hands glowing with a soft, radiant light. Callum watched, transfixed, as her energy surged. The light, bluey glow of her skin intensified, becoming brighter, more tangible, as if she were absorbing the very essence of the universe itself. Her body trembled, but she pushed through it, her expression tight with focus. Suddenly, with a sharp exhale, the glow around her flared. The walls of the cellar seemed to pulse with the power radiating from her, and the hum outside grew louder in response, as if it had sensed what she was doing. "Rhea, stop!" Callum shouted, fear rising in his chest. "It's too much." But she didn't stop. Her eyes were wide, her mouth pressed into a thin line as she gritted her teeth. I have to hold it," she gasped. Her voice trembled with strain, but her focus never wavered. "I can't let them." Before she could finish, there was a violent crash from above, a loud thud that echoed through the cabin like a warning. The trapdoor trembled as though something was pushing against it from the other side. The force of it sent a shock wave through the room, rattling the walls and sending dust swirling into the air. Rhea's energy flared, a sudden burst of light that lit up the entire cellar in a blinding flash. Callum shielded his eyes, the intensity of it nearly knocking him off his feet. The hum from outside surged with an eerie intensity, and for a moment, Callum could hear the voices of the Erethians clearly again, this time filled with frustration and anger. "She's activating the shield." The voice rang through the air like a cold, metallic warning. "Foolish girl." The ground beneath Callum's feet seemed to tremble, the very earth shifting as if it had been awakened by the threat outside. Rhea's body was shaking now, her face pale with effort as she forced herself to hold the energy. The light surrounding her flickered, unstable. "We don't have much time," she gasped, barely able to keep her voice steady. "It's not enough. They're too strong." Callum looked at her, panic rising in his chest as he saw how much the energy was draining from her. She was already so weak, and this, whatever it was clearly taking its toll. He couldn't let her do this alone. He had to do something, anything. "I'm going to help you," Callum said, his voice tight. He didn't know how, but he couldn't just stand by and let her burn out. Rhea's eyes flickered to him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flash of fear in them. You can't," she whispered. You're not connected to it. You're not from." "I don't care." Callum interrupted, his voice raw. "I don't care what you are, what they want. You're not going through this alone. Not while I'm here." Without waiting for her reply, he reached out, taking her hand in his. As his fingers brushed against hers, he felt it, a strange electric charge, like a bridge connecting him to the very core of her power. It was a rush of energy, so intense it almost knocked the breath out of him. The sensation was alien and frightening, but he held on, refusing to pull away. Rhea's eyes widened as their energies intertwined, the glow from her skin amplifying in response to his touch. Her breath came faster now, the strain visible on her face. "Callum, you don't know what this could do." "I don't care," he repeated, his voice steady. "We're in this together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The power between them grew, a delicate balance of light and shadow, as Rhea's energy began to settle, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. The hum outside grew fainter, less certain, as if the Erethians were sensing the shield taking form. But even as the barrier began to solidify, Callum knew it wouldn't last long. And when it came down, the Erethians would be there, and they would come for Rhea. But for now, he held on to her, and he would fight for her, for as long as he could. Chapter 5, The Final Stand. The air in the cellar had turned thick with tension, like the world itself was holding its breath. The energy Rhea had summoned had settled, creating a fragile shield around them, an invisible barrier that kept the Erethians at bay for now. But Callum could feel it in his bones. It was only temporary. Rhea was barely holding on, her strength almost spent, and the Erethians would not stop until they had her. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Rhea's grip on his hand had weakened, but she still managed a faint smile. Her light blue skin shimmered with a pale glow, and despite the exhaustion in her eyes, she looked determined. She'd given everything she had to protect them both, and now it was up to Callum to do the impossible. He had no idea how he could help, but as his fingers intertwined with hers, he felt the strange, electric connection again. It was like an unspoken bond, one that pulsed with an energy that wasn't entirely of this world. For the first time since all of this began, Callum felt a flicker of certainty, like he was where he needed to be. "Rhea," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "You've done enough. I'll keep you safe. I promise." Rhea's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, her starry gaze soft but full of an ancient sadness. "You don't understand, Callum. They'll stop at nothing to reclaim me. They'll have to go through me first," Callum said, cutting her off. He squeezed her hand, trying to offer some reassurance, but deep down, he knew he couldn't stop them forever. Suddenly, the hum from outside grew louder, reverberating through the walls, vibrating in Callum's bones. The Erethians had found them. They were close, too close. Callum's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced toward the trapdoor. He didn't have much time. "Stay here," Callum said quickly. "I'm going to buy us some time." Rhea's grip tightened on his hand, and for a moment he thought she might protest. But instead, she simply nodded, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. "I'll be right back," Callum promised. "I'll figure something out." He stood and took one last look at her, watching as she sank deeper into herself, her exhaustion evident. The glow around her had faded, and the shield was flickering, its strength waning by the second. He had to act fast. Moving quietly, Callum approached the trapdoor, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. This wasn't just about protecting Rhea anymore. It was about stopping whatever these creatures were, whatever they wanted from her. And if he had to face them alone, he would. With a swift motion, he lifted the trapdoor and emerged into the dimly lit cabin. The strange lights in the sky had vanished, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt like a warning, like the calm before the storm. Callum grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, an old hunting rifle left behind by the previous owner of the cabin. It was heavy in his hands, unfamiliar, but he didn't need to be an expert to know how to aim and fire if it came to that. He wouldn't let Rhea face them alone. He stepped cautiously toward the front door, keeping low to the ground. His senses were on high alert as he listened for any sign of movement. The hum had faded for a moment, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, just as Callum reached for the doorknob, a sharp, cold voice cut through the silence. "You cannot run from us, Rhea." Callum's blood ran cold as he turned to face the voice. He hadn't seen them yet, but he could feel their presence, an unnatural pressure that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The Erethians were here. From the shadows of the trees outside, figures emerged, tall and imposing, their features shrouded in darkness, but their glowing eyes piercing through the night like twin stars. They moved with an unsettling grace, their steps silent, their energy palpable. One of them, the leader by the look of it, stepped forward, a tall figure with dark, angular features and a cloak that seemed to ripple like liquid. His eyes locked onto Callum's with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. "You dare to defy us, human?" the Erethian leader said, his voice cold as ice. "You are nothing but a distraction." Callum's hands tightened around the rifle, but his voice was steady as he replied, "I won't let you take her." The Erethian leader tilted his head, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You cannot protect her. She belongs to us." The words hit Callum like a slap, but he refused to back down. He raised the rifle, aiming it at the leader's chest. He didn't know if it would work. Hell, he didn't even know if the rifle could stop them. But he had to try. "Stay away from her," Callum said, his voice low and threatening. The Erethian leader let out a soft, mocking laugh. You think you can stop us with a mere weapon? He raised a hand, and with a flick of his fingers, the rifle was yanked from Callum's grasp, sent crashing against the far wall. Callum's breath caught in his throat as he took a step back, instinctively reaching for another weapon. But the Erethian wasn't finished. With a sudden, sharp motion, the Erethian leader lunged toward him, faster than Callum could react. In an instant, the alien's hand was around his throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "You're too weak," the Erethian hissed, his grip tightening. Callum gasped for air, his mind spinning. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He had failed. He had failed to protect Rhea. But then, through the haze of pain, he heard her voice. It was weak, but it was there. No. Rhea's voice was filled with power, and it cut through the tension in the air like a blade. The Erethian leader froze, his eyes flickering toward her as she emerged from the cellar, her body trembling, but her gaze fierce. "Let him go," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority Callum had never heard before. The Erethian leader hesitated for a moment, and in that brief instant, Rhea unleashed the full force of her power. The air around her crackled with energy, and the shield that had been protecting them flared back to life, this time stronger than ever. Callum's feet hit the ground as the Erethian's grip loosened. He gasped for air, his body still reeling from the alien strength. But Rhea was standing tall now, her arms raised, her eyes glowing with the intensity of 1,000 stars. "You will not take me," Rhea said, her voice unwavering. "I am not your queen anymore. I am free." The Erethian leader snarled, his eyes flashing with fury. But the power emanating from Rhea was too much for him to counter. With a final, furious cry, he and his followers staggered back, unable to breach the shield. Rhea stepped forward, and with a final, sweeping gesture, she sent the Erethians crashing to the ground with an explosion of energy that sent shockwaves through the forest. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and the trees around them swayed in response to the sheer force of Rhea's power. The Erethians were gone, vanquished in a blaze of light and shadow. Rhea collapsed to her knees, her body drained, but her expression peaceful for the first time since Callum had found her. Callum rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "Rhea, you did it?" She smiled weakly, her eyes flickering as if struggling to stay awake. "We did it," she corrected softly. Callum held her gently, his heart pounding in his chest, but the weight in his chest had lifted. The Erethians were gone, and Rhea was finally free. For the first time, they could both breathe easy. And as Rhea rested her head against his shoulder, Callum realized that this quiet moment, with the forest alive and calm around them, was all they had ever wanted. And in this new world they had made, it was enough.